guys already, hello. Great. I assume you guys already know about like Booleaning stuff in Maya and how to do that. I want to show you some other ways to do it in case Maya is, again, being evil. So let me just really quick find, I have somewhere on my computer, this ridiculous little head model that I use for like everything. I just want to find the separate one so I know which one it is. All right, so you can see I have this model, like weird character that I've been using forever of my head. And basically right now everything is just clipping through it, everything else. I have like each individual pieces for hair, etc. So if you were so inclined, you could go into Mesh Mixer and do stuff. And you can Boolean stuff in there. I'll show you how to do it. I don't necessarily recommend it because it's usually a little bit awkward and it doesn't do a great job in certain areas. So in Mesh Mixer, just go to the Edit menu. And there should be, wait for it. They actually have like a Boolean function, but usually I'll just use the Make Solid feature again. And that's going to go through, and you can see if I sort of turn on my wireframe with W, that it's just gone through, and it's done a really awful job on all the edges and the seams. And you can switch this to be like a denser mesh and more accuracy, and it still a lot of times does really bad stuff for like hard creases. So you can do this if you want. It's usually like my personal last resort. You can also, if you need to, use ZBrush to Boolean stuff. The creepy mask. And there's like a few sort of different, there we go, okay, great, what are you doing? My computer's gone nuts. All right, so I'm just gonna really quick like export a few different pieces of this as like individual pieces. And I'll show you guys a really, really, really handy tool for going into ZBrush. And I'll do a little bit more like sort of ZBrush, like basic stuff like how to navigate it and how to sculpt in it at the end if you want to stay for that closed demo thing. This is, you don't really need to know how to move around in the scene or anything like that for this stuff. All right, eyes. Maya takes so long. I think it's actually Mesh Mixer, just like crashing my computer. All right, so you can see if you go back into Mesh Mixer, we have now a much, much denser mesh. It still didn't do a great job. Like there's some fuzzies around the seams of things. A lot of times, like particularly around sharp corners, like in the eyes, it doesn't do a terribly great job hanging on to those. So again, a lot of times I usually don't use Mesh Mixer, but you can if you're really desperate or if it's like the only thing that works. All right. Feel free to stop me with questions. This is just sort of like lots of quick demos of like, you can do this if you want kind of things. And it should not be taking Maya this long to export this file. I have no idea what's going on.
You mentioned last week that
yes.
Mixer is supposed to be in the lab.
It should be. I checked it on, I think, one of them. I like the teacher station, I think in 248, I know has it. Have you checked and like not found it? Is that?
Yeah, I couldn't find it in 252.
Interesting. I will yell at IT about that. I feel like every class I end up being like, hey IT, help. All right, cool. Yes. Yeah, if you guys ever find like programs aren't in the labs, I also checked 248, again, teacher station for Cura, and they did have that. But I haven't checked any of the other classrooms for any of that. Yeah.
Is Mesh Mixer free?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So,
Yeah, Mesh Mixer is delightful and free,
sure.
and delightful sometimes. I think the only, I'll go over a paid slicer today because there's like some cool functionality for it, and they do have one license of it downstairs in the hybrid lab. So you guys could go down and slice your stuff there if you wanted to. You could also use my computer if I was around. Where am I going? Self-Carrick, super dense. But yeah, most of the stuff that I'm going to show you guys in terms of like additional programs are actually like free stuff that you can just sort of download. Because free programs are great. All right. All right, cool. So So we have some like bits and pieces of this. So like I was saying, you can Boolean stuff in ZBrush. So I'm just going to go ahead and make a new document. Please don't save this weird head. So has anybody never used ZBrush before? Okay. So I can go over, again, I'll go over like how to navigate within the scene and like sculpt stuff later. Just like really quick, there's 2 ways to make a new file. There's like document, new document. Can you guys see? Sweet. And then there's also file and like open and save. So the file tab and the document tab will both save different types of files, which is super weird. Usually I just use the document tab. Apart from that, that's probably the only disclaimer that you need at this point. So I'm just going to go over, usually it's set up so you can see all of these like import menus and stuff at the upper right. So just go to import, and I'm going to grab my head from somewhere. Where am I going? No. Did I not just have? I saved them as Maya. Dang it. Sorry, hang on for 5 seconds. No, where did I saved in the scenes folder. Sorry. There we go. All right. So I'm just going to grab the head. And then to actually get it in the scene, you just need to left mouse button click and drag, and you can see that it'll just plop that in the scene. Once you've done that, you need to click on this little edit button here. And that's usually at this point you would start like sculpting on it or doing whatever else you wanted. ZBrush nav is like super weird, and there's no way to set it to Maya nav. It's like some unholy combination of like Alt Control and like the middle and right mouse buttons. I'll go over that again a little bit later. So we have this in here, and there's a really, really great feature, which you guys should all totally take note of because it'll probably come in handy at some point during this class. But if you go to Z plugin, you can actually export or import multiple models as subtools, and I'll just sort of, it's basically like, think of subtools as almost like your outliner, where it's like each subtool is like its own object basically. If you have this particular subtool selected, that's the only one that you're going to be able to sculpt and doodle on at a given time. But functionally, what I need if I want to Boolean all these together is all of the pieces imported at the same time in the correct spot. So if you go up to the menus at the top, you'll see a little drop down for Z plugins. Go down to, where is it? Subtool Master. And click on that. And there's this lovely button for multi-append. So this is what you're going to use to bring in the rest of your files. In the correct spot, all the separate subtools, mostly just in the correct spot. So click on that. Great. Wait for the computer to process whatever you're doing. And then go in and just select whatever additional meshes you needed. And you can do this multiple times if you're like, oh no, I forgot like half of them are in a different spot. So I'm going to grab, again, hair and the eyes. Go ahead and open those. And it's done some like real terrifying things. But you can see that over here in my little subtool list, I now have eyeballs and some hair. I've also turned the visibility off on the head. So I'm just going to turn the visibility on with this little eyeball icon. So we have all of this stuff like now, again, in the scene, in the correct spot. What you're going to do is go up to the top right next to that edit button that I just said to click on. To the left of that, there's a giant button that says Live Boolean. Turn that on. And presumably, usually, at least when I'm doing this, I'm trying to do a Boolean union, so I'm trying to like just combine all of the final pieces of my mesh together. So what you want to do is there's actually, hopefully you guys can see it, but there's a bunch of different like sort of overlapping circles denoting the different types of Booleans that you can do. So we have, the first one is like a Boolean union. The second one with the sort of like crescent circle and a mini cutout is a difference. And then the last one is a Boolean intersection. So depending on the operation that you want done, select the different Booleans. So again, in this case, Live Boolean is actually like really, really cool. because you can actually see without doing, like actually calculating any Booleans. Like if I take the eyes and I set that to be different, so like the middle icon, you can sort of preview that it's chopped out part of the head in the shape of the eyeball. So it's like surprisingly responsive. And it doesn't commit any of these changes until you actually select like Boolean, do the thing. So this is basically just a preview during live Boolean. So in this case, I'm just going to leave it, again, all as union, since I want these all into one piece. And I'm just going to, I say scroll down, but the method of scrolling in the sidebar is just left-clicking and dragging, which is, frankly, kind of awkward to me. But if you scroll down, there's this little button in the subtool menu for Booleans. And all you need to do at this point is literally just do make Boolean mesh. And it's just going to go through, do some processing. It might take like a few seconds. It takes longer, obviously, like the denser your mesh is. But it's going to go through and like process that really quick. And then whenever it's done, it should drop it's usually called like umesh something or another, but it's going to drop this like extra file up here right under the little load tool. So if you just click on that, you can see that it's basically my new mesh, and it's just one subtool. Everything's been combined. I'll do Shift F to show the wireframe. As of yet, I'm admittedly very, very bad with polygroups. So you can see that like it's basically taken all the different pieces and it's sort of showing them as a different color. It's going to do a weird thing when I export that. There's a really dumb workaround in Maya until I figure out how to like properly have it attach things together. But you can see if you go in and look at the edges that it's basically has geometry connecting all the way through, and it's done a pretty decent job like attaching the stuff together without a bunch of stuff on the like clipping geometry on the inside of the mesh. So I'm just going to go ahead and export this really quick. And throw this into Maya and show you what we have. Sweet goodness. My file placement has just gone completely out the window. So you can see when we bring this in, it looks good, but you'll also notice that like when I click on these individual pieces, it is just sort of individual chunks of head, which isn't quite what we want. So usually if I do stuff in ZBrush, I just go through, grab all the different pieces, do a mesh combine, and then also do a edit mesh and merge. And I'll usually set the distance threshold to something like 0.01. But basically what that does is it just goes through and again connects all of these little pieces so you have an actual functional mesh. Yes. I'm admittedly really, really bad with polygroups. So for the sake of argument, if I go down to like polygroups, I've tried like auto groups, I've tried a few other things. Is there like a good way you know to do that?
I mean, there's all these like hotkeys.
Yeah.
And it's hard to remember off the top of my head, but
Yeah. No, I feel your pain.
Alt W and then like or something like that, and then like drag. I don't remember.
That's fair. Okay. Oh God. Yeah, I've been like trying to figure out a good way to like export it as one model, and it took me like 20 minutes of Googling to figure out how to do an actual Boolean in ZBrush. But yeah, it's a little weird. Cool. Yeah, I mean, if you find stuff, that would be lovely. I also have like my own weird like list of ZBrush notes. But yeah, it's very powerful program. Sometimes it's a little counterintuitive. But yeah, so that's usually my workaround for not knowing how to like export it as a single mesh is to just dump it in Maya and then just do a merge. And you can see that like if I smooth this, all of this is actually one piece. And now you have a lovely Boolean mesh that's combined and like ready to print. So anybody have any questions on the ZBrush bit? Yeah.
Is there a hole going up that?
Yeah, this is a 40 millimeter head that I designed, and I use it to test. Oh, that looks awful smooth. I use it to test paints, and I was like, oh, wouldn't it be convenient if I could like stick it on a skewer and then paint it? And It ended up not being convenient, so I took out the hole, but that's why the hole is. I was trying to be clever. Any other questions? Cool. And this should be recording, so if you guys need to like go back and reference what I just did, I'll throw these up. If not at the end of class, then when I get home. So that's ZBrush. And again, usually, because it's like extra steps, I'll do that if Maya explodes, which sometimes it actually does very badly on this model. The other sort of dark horse candidate, which I've only just started playing with, is this default 3D builder program that comes on Windows computers. And it's surprisingly robust. So it's called 3D Builder. I'm just going to go and do load object, figure out where the heck I put this. Yes, good. So we have this. Ignore. It's just asking for like a material file. And I'm like, I don't care in the slightest. Excuse me. So I'm just going to go ahead and check import model. The one thing I don't like about this program is and I haven't looked much into a workaround, honestly, but it will sort of shift the position of your model. So when you import it back into Maya, it's in a different spot, which is a little annoying. But it does, so this is, again, just like a bunch of different clipping meshes through each other. And you can see in the bottom corner, it's flagged like, hey, this is not a valid object. You want to repair it? So I'm just going to click that, and it's going to go through and sort of repair this. And I actually realized the other day that usually means, hey, I'm going to go through and I'm going to Boolean the whole mesh together. And it does seem to do a pretty good job. It might take a really long time if your model is dense, but it did a good job Booleaning. So you can actually see if you happen to be watching the, oh God, how do I navigate in this? Too many different navigations. So you can see if you look at the edges that it's actually gone through and again sort of like connected all the edges there. And you can go through like view and do like wireframe, shading. I'm still really bad at like controlling this, but this is basically, again, just going through and Boolean the mesh together. Pretty low effort. Things to be aware of with this particular program, as with Mesh Mixer, this will also automatically tessellate your model. And it seems like there should be a way to turn that off. I haven't found it. I also haven't looked very hard. But do just be aware that if you throw it in right now, it's going to tessellate your stuff. But it will Boolean it. So that is like different ways to Boolean stuff together, because I'm sure at some point, if you've not already found it, if you've tried a Boolean in Maya and it like just isn't working and your meshes disappear, usually these other programs can like handle that better than Maya for some reason. So yeah. Anybody have any questions on the Booleans? Cool. How many of you thought you would be getting lessons for like 20 minutes about how to Boolean objects together? It seems like sacrilege in any other class. All right. So the other thing that I wanted to go over really quick is, let me just make sure that I actually did all that stuff. All right. So I also wanted to go over how to reduce really, really dense meshes. So if you've gone through in something like ZBrush and you've like added a lot of sculpting detail into your model, and your model is now, 5 million polygons, don't try to export that. It's going to explode everything. And I speak from experience with that, which is sad. So there's really, really efficient ways to reduce your mesh. So possibly the worst of all of these ways is to grab, so this is just like that thing that I Boolean together in Mesh Mixer. I saved it out because the file was really dense, and it saved me condensing it later. Oh, my laptop is so slow. No idea what the rest of this stuff is. All right, so the worst possible way to do this, in my opinion, is to go in and do mesh, reduce. It half the time does weird stuff for tessellated models, but also like it doesn't do anything with rhyme or reason. It literally, as far as I can tell, picks completely arbitrary edge loops and just deletes them out of your model. Okay, this is, it also takes a really long time. So you can do this, but like I almost never do. The other way to do this is in Mesh Mixer. which used to be sort of my go-to standard for doing this until I realized that ZBrush has a much more efficient way of also reducing your mesh. So, in Mesh Mixer, do Control-A to select everything. Okay, there we go. So Control-A, and then it's like in the Edit menu under Edit and Reduce, or the hotkey is Shift-R. You can go in, and it's gonna. My computer is like, why do you have 30 programs open right now? My God. Fun test slice of a helmet that I did for a guy, which I am closing because my computer cannot handle this. Don't know why Steam is trying to open. Great. So the thing that I am not a huge fan of with the Mesh Mixer Reduce is you'll notice it's doing a crap ton of calculations before it's even giving me any options for what I want to do to the reduce. So by default, it usually does, like, it's just going to strip away 50% of the polygons. It does a better job than the Maya Reduce in the sense that it'll actually look at, like, hey, areas with high detail, I'm going to leave some more polys there than, like, giant flat areas. But again, it usually takes a while, especially with really, really dense objects. And before I knew about the ZBrush functionality, so you can see it's gone through and it's like, hey, okay, we've reduced 50% of the mesh. I'm going to hit W to look at my wireframe. It's going to lag really badly. And you can see that it's like a little bit less dense. So usually with this, because if I edit these settings at all, it's going to require me to wait for it to process again. I just sort of accept it and do this repeatedly until it's at a level where it either updates the settings faster or I am actually just happy with the amount of polys it's stripped out. But you can kind of see if my computer doesn't explode that it has sort of tried to, maybe in the areas of a little bit more detail, like around the corners of the eyes in particular, it'll usually keep a little bit more geometry around that. And then you can just sort of systematically go through again, and it gets faster the more you do it because it's calculating less things. And eventually you'll have something that you're happy with, but it takes forever. When I say it takes forever, I mean I've literally put like 3 million poly meshes into Mesh Mixer, and it took 4 hours to compute one reduce. So I sort of resigned myself at one point, like, okay, I'm going to finish a file. It's going to take me 3 hours to make this high detail model. And it's just going to take me like 3 days to compress it. Like, it's going to be great. But you can see like this is getting down to a better level. But yeah, so that's Mesh Mixer. Any questions on that? Cool. This is sort of my last resort, or like I don't have ZBrush available right now. Like, let me use Mesh Mixer. So there's again, great way to do this in ZBrush. I'm just going to start a new document. No. Go to my import tool, and again, just sort of, which one was it? Grab my really gross dense mesh, throw that in. And again, same thing we did before, so whenever you draw your object in, you just want to go and click edit so that you can, tweak your object, and if you don't click edit, it's going to keep drawing in more heads, which is presumably not what you want. So, once again, in the in the Z plugin menu, this is like my favorite ZBrush find of all time. The plugin is called Decimation Master. It's fairly straightforward to use. There's some options about like keeping UVs and freezing borders that usually I never bother with because I'm just doing this for 3D printing and the UVs and stuff are completely irrelevant. So what you want to do is just go and do pre-process current. It's going to be like whatever subtool you're currently working on. And it's just going to go through and calculate. It's basically storing the information about the geometry to your computer so that it can access it and modify it faster in the future. Super dense meshes, it usually takes a little bit longer as usual, but it's pretty much gone through and done that already. And so now what I'm going to do, if you go through, again, to your Z plugin menu, you can twiddle with the percentage of decimation. So usually I just sort of try 20% is the default and see what it does. So I'm just going to hit decimate current. And you can see that it's gone through insanely quickly, and it's stripped like a lot of polys out of this. You'll also notice it is doing a little bit of a weird thing where it's keeping the geometry around all of the sort of original faces. That's actually a sort of remnant of what Mesh Mixer does. When you make solid a mesh, it really holds to those faces. So it'll just make like really, really dense mesh and just keep all of the face information in it, which is a little bit strange. So that's just like what you're seeing there. If this was a smooth mesh done in something else, it would do a little bit better job of like not keeping all that insane faceting. We can go through, and again, so I can say, okay, maybe I actually want that reduced a little bit more. I'm going to try 4% of the polys. And you can see that it's actually gone through, and again, stripped out all of those like extra weird little bevels on the edge there. It also tells you like how many, it gives you an estimation of like how many polys you want, so you can just set that and say, okay, maybe I actually want this to be like, 7,000 polys, and I'm going to decimate that. I get something a little bit more aggressively low poly. So it's like an insanely powerful tool, and it usually does a really, really, really good job of like keeping detail in super dense areas and stripping the crap out of less dense areas. And again, you can see that was like way faster and more responsive than the Mesh Mixer one. So that's pretty much just, again, in ZBrush, import your model, go to Z plugin, pre-process current so that your computer stores the information, and then just keep playing with this until you get a number or a look that you like for your model. You might need to, if your mesh is like crazy dense, like 10 or 15 million polys, you might need to like reduce it down and then reduce it again to get as few as you want. But it does tend to do a really, really good job of, keeping detail, but giving you like the smallest file size for the maximum detail possible. It's insanely powerful. It's easily, again, one of the best tools I found for 3D printing. Does anybody have any questions on how to use that? All right. Other fun tidbit, if you're just like, in terms of order of doing things, it does usually, in my experience, make sense to reduce your meshes before trying to Boolean them together. It'll just make your life easier and faster. And ZBrush's menus are insane. I love ZBrush, but the menus are super weird. Blah, blah, blah. Great. Cool. Notes. Great. All right. Apart from that, that's actually pretty much all of the like modeling stuff I wanted to go over. It's like really just geared towards, you can do like high poly closed sculpts in ZBrush or whatever, and then like combine them and reduce them. Same thing for your weapon. So don't be afraid, again, if you want to go in and like sculpt a bunch of crazy detail, because by the time that ZBrush finishes with it, it's going to be a relatively small file size. Things I wish I learned way earlier, honestly. But any questions on any of that stuff? All right. In that case, I'm going to really quick just introduce you to another slicer. And this is, why do I not have it open? It's called Simplify. ZBrush, away. Why are you doing this? That's not a word. All right, so it's called Simplify3D. And again, this is a paid slicer. I think it was like $150 for a perpetual license of it. They do have one copy of it in the Make Lab on the computers downstairs. So if you need it, you can go down there. Or again, if you can find me around, I do have it on my laptop. So you can harvest my laptop for a few minutes if I'm not using it and like slice your stuff. But there's just like a few really, really handy settings. So I'll give you like an overview of kind of like where everything is, like where the standard options for things are. And then I'll go through how to do one like super crazy powerful thing, which might actually save you a lot of time and improve print quality while still saving time. So this is basically what it looks like when you first set it up. If I remember correctly, it'll ask you to like configure, actually no, it doesn't even do that, it's weird. All right, so you can go to import your mesh. And in this case, I think I'm just gonna do the weird multi-head mask thing because I have it here. So this is actually just fun tidbit, a remix of the face that I put on the rig, which was like a character I made, which was the mask, and I just keep using that face over and over. So Simplify does actually have hotkeys for like moving and rotating and stuff. Usually what I do, if you double click on the model, it'll just pull up all of these like translate settings and such over here. And you can enter in specific values for your rotation. I find this just to be the easiest way to get 90-degree angles on stuff. So in this case, I printed it upside down. So that's usually where you'd access the rotations again. Just double click on the model. Or you can use the standard, like W I think is translate, and then you can just drag it around. R is rotate, etc. They do have a nice handy feature, which is just like center and arrange, which I guess Cura has its own version of too, but that'll basically just snap into the center of your build plate. And then the prepare to print button is the equivalent of the slice button in Cura. You'll also notice that if you click that, it's like, in this case, it's like, hey, you need a manufacturing process before slicing. This is basically asking you to enter your settings for your printer. So like layer height, temperature, all that good stuff. To do that, just go into this little processes menu and do add. So I actually have, you can save presets and stuff if you like them. So I just have this preset here I'm just going to use randomly. So basic like important settings. In the extruder tab, you have things for nozzle diameter. Extrusion multiplier is just sort of, do you want, like, what percentage of the plastic do you want to print? If it's a lower number, it's saying, like, don't quite print as much. If it's, like, higher than 1, it's saying print a little bit more, etc. Usually I don't play with that too much. Usually I also don't play with extrusion width. But it also has your settings for retraction. The retraction vertical lift is Z-hop. So if any of you guys have been using Z-hop, that's where it is in Simplify. And then it does some other stuff down here. I'm not going to super crazy go into these right now. There's a lot of documentation about them online. I mostly sort of like want to familiarize you with where things are. Also, if you guys ever use Simplify and you're like, oh, there's this one great setting in Cura that I can't find, just Google like Z-hop in Simplify3D and like someone has asked it already and like there will be answers. That's how I learned where like half the stuff was in this, honestly. So that's in the extruder tab, again, for like nozzle diameter, retraction, that kind of stuff. Layer tab right here is you're going to find your layer height and the number of solid top and bottom layers, as well as the number of perimeters that you have. You also have the option to print the inside stuff first, so like your infill and then your outer walls, or you could do your outer walls and then your infill. I think they also have an option for that in Cura. In general, I personally prefer to do inside out just because it usually goes a little bit better quality on the outside. It also sort of helps for overhang. Like if it's going to have ugly areas, it does that on the inner layers. So by the time it gets to the outside, it has something to sort of tack that plastic onto, if that makes sense. Honestly, both work fine for most models. You also have a little bit of information about where you want to stash your Z-seams. Like in Cura, you had like I don't even remember what it's called, to be honest. But this is your like Z-seam information. So you can sort of pick random starting points. Again, optimize for print speed or choose a start point in a specific location. I used to just sort of do fastest printing speed, and now I'm kind of like, I do like when my Z-seams, like if you're going to have like little blobs like where the nozzle starts and stops for each layer, kind of aligning them in one area so it's easy to go through and like sand them and fix them, and you don't need to sort of search for them. But again, those options are there if you need them. Additions is where you're going to find stuff like skirts and brims, and some of this other stuff which I usually don't play with ever. Mostly I just come here for the brim settings. Pretty much ignore anywhere that says primary extruder. It should say primary extruder, but it gives you options for like adding multiple extruders into your prints, etc., which is not relevant at all for these printers. But you can do, so skirt outlines is basically, how many times do you want the, what am I saying? How many little rings around your model do you want? So if you're doing, like for the little Veroni, like pink Veroni pattern there, I suggested something like 10. So it would basically just do 10 outlines around the model. You can also do a really, really interesting thing, which I don't think exists in Cura, and choose the skirt offset from the part. So in Cura, it was either you had to select skirt or you had to select brim. In this case, you sort of define which one you want by this skirt offset. So if I set this to like 3 millimeters, it treats it basically like a skirt would in Cura, where it's going to put a ring around your object but not touching it. If I set this to 0, it's going to function like a brim, and it's just going to do 10 layers connected to your object. You can also do an interesting thing and set this to like small numbers like 0.4. So theoretically, it's a brim, like your object is still connected, but just barely. So it's like good for if it's just enough to hold it on the build plate, but it makes it a little bit easier to remove theoretically. So that's like skirt offset. You can also, if you want, set your skirt to print for more than one layer, which I have never had cause to do, but you can do it. So that's that. Any questions on any of this so far? All right. So we also have a setting for infill, fairly self-explanatory. They give you different patterns you can play with. I just sort of picked a honeycomb one and haven't changed it. I feel like honeycomb tends to be stronger than like lines or something, but I honestly have never really had an issue with any of them. So you can, again, set your infill percentage. Most of this stuff I don't usually play with. Sometimes that's actually a great setting. Sometimes I will play with the minimum infill length, which is basically like if you're doing like really, really thin walls that are like a millimeter thick, or be putting like a millimeter dot of plastic, you can use this to sort of filter out those really, really tiny moves. It'll save print time. Sometimes I feel like also those little like tiny plastic blobs that it's trying to put end up getting kind of weird and like making blobs in your print. So if that's an issue, you could consider fiddling with this number. The other really sort of powerful thing that Simplify does is it allows you to combine your infill every X layers. So basically, if I set this to 2, instead of printing infill every single layer, you can actually print it every other layer. So the caveat with this is that it works great for really, really low layer height. So if I have, like right now, my layer height is set to 0.1. So instead of printing a 0.1 outer perimeter and then a 0.1 thick infill, it's going to print a 0.1 outer layer, another 0.1 outer layer, and then go through and just sort of fill in that area with a 0.2 millimeter layer height support or infill. So it can help speed up your print times pretty significantly, actually. The caveat is if you're printing at like a really high layer height, like 0.3, you do have to keep this on every layer because it can't take a 0.4 millimeter nozzle and squish a 0.6 layer height blob of plastic out of it. It just won't work. But for something like 0.1 millimeter layer height or 0.2, this works really, really great if you set this to like 2 or 3 layers. So it's pretty nice. So they also have settings for manual support generation if you want it. But here's just some like random support settings. And again, they give you the option to combine your support if you want every few layers. Again, only works on smaller layer heights. And you can do like, that's a good point, I should probably go over that. So you can just have auto support generated. You can turn this off and it'll just not generate any support. Here's your temperature tab. So you have the control over your heated bed temperature and the primary extruder. If you want to change these, just double click it, enter a new number, and you're good to go. And they also give you settings for your fan speed under cooling. Usually I just sort of leave these at the defaults. It does pretty decent stuff. And for the most part, the only other tab that you probably like need to know about is the printing speeds. So again, this is like kind of same deal as Kira. Like, do you want to print on how fast do you want stuff to print? Yeah, that's I feel like pretty self-explanatory. There are some other tabs. There's like a G-code tab. So this, I guess, is important actually. I don't usually touch it now, but this is where I set up the build volume of the printer. So again, the G-code tab under build volume. You should look up, if you're slicing these for the Prusas or for your own machines, just look up the build volume and just enter those numbers into here. Like if I tried to print this on the Prusas, it would probably explode the machine because this build volume is way bigger than those. And I'm pretty sure they actually don't have sensors to check if the nozzle is about to like run off the side of the printer and like run into the side of it. Apart from that, I usually just leave most of this the way it is, and I mostly just come here for the build volume. There are some other random settings in the Advanced tab. Probably don't need to pay attention to a lot of these. The only thing you might need is thin wall behavior. So that's if you had like you're using a 0.4 millimeter nozzle and you had like a teeny wall that was like 0.3 millimeters thin. And normally it would just leave a gap in your model. If you turn this on to allow single extrusion walls, it should try to go back and compensate and just draw like a little teeny line of plastic for that like 0.3 millimeter wall. Honestly, sometimes this is like a little bit glitchy for me, but it does exist if you need it. I'm just not gonna like super go over it at this point. So that's pretty much that. Does anybody have any questions on that so far? All right. Only other thing they do if you want to generate supports for your model, this weird icon thing at the very bottom on the right. If you double click on that, it gives you some different types of supports you could do. So you have normal, which is basically everywhere. And then you can also select from build platform only. So depending on what you want, pick that. Support pillar resolution is basically kind of the same thing, more or less, as support density in Cura. I'm not gonna lie, I kind of like the density. It just like makes more sense to my head in Cura, like the way they word that. But this is basically saying if I set this at 2 millimeters, it's gonna do a gap of about 2 millimeters between each little pillar of support. So if you need more support, you would want to enter smaller numbers, like maybe 1 millimeter, etc. Max overhang angle is pretty much at what point does it start generating supports. So at this point, you can just do generate auto supports, and it's going to go through and add a lot of like really tiny, fine supports into my model in a way that is honestly deeply terrifying. I did custom supports for this model because it doesn't print well with the auto supports most of the time. It also does, so if you guys have ever tried to like delete supports in Cura, it's an absolute nightmare. This at least does have the functionality where if you want, you can just do remove existing supports. And I'm not gonna say this is a fast process for something like this, but you can just sort of like click on these supports and you can see that it's just going through and deleting them. It can be a little bit fiddly, and again, for something like this with like hundreds of supports I don't want, so not a great option. But it does exist if there's like one or two that are like causing you issues that you want to get rid of. You can also go through and add new support structures. So if I was like, hey, I want a bunch of supports like around the eyeballs or whatever, and you can just manually add those in. So the supports are a little bit more functional than the Cura version of things. So I'm actually just gonna get rid of all that because it's gonna make test slicing a lot more annoying. All right, what if you stop doing things? What do you? Okay. I've never had support generation crash before. Good, good. Okay, I don't really know what this is doing. I assume it'll just process in a second. So that's basically how to use Simplify. And I'm showing you this because there's a really, really cool feature that, again, can help you basically choose different settings, different print settings, for different parts of your model. And this can help to either improve quality in a specific area and have overall good print speeds. So I'm going to go in really quick and just do edit my process settings and set this to a 0.3 millimeter layer height, which is about as thick as I would want to go with a 0.4 millimeter nozzle. So I'll do a test slice and we'll see how long this is going to take. It's probably going to be something, I probably could have chose a model that was like a little bit less complex. Wait for it. Haha. All right. So, yes, a different model would have been delightful. Oh, that looks ridiculous. All right. Simplify's been being a little weird with my supports, but all right, this is. Okay. So what it's done is it's. So you can set up manual supports, which is again like what I showed you with like the adding of support. So that'll pretty much override any other support settings that you have in your support tab. short of turning off supports. If you turn off supports in your support tab, it will not print any of your predefined supports. But if you have predefined supports, it's going to override any of the other settings in here because you've gone out of your way to define them. So in this case, I'm just going to turn off support material because I want a faster slice. And I thought I unchecked this. Ignore that for now. So it should go through. And I know because I've printed this already that it takes about a day to print this at like the thickest layer height you'd want to do on these machines. But I just want to like get a number so we can sort of reference that. All right, so this estimates 19 hours and 57 minutes. I'm just going to say 20 hours with no supports, and that's again pretty much the thickest layer height you'd want to play with here. So in this case, so looking at this, apart from the fact that there's literally no supports at all on this model, where are some areas that you guys think might be like problem areas in terms of aggressive overhangs or anything like that on this model? Mm-hmm. Yeah, most definitely. Some of them actually, like this one actually printed supportless. But yeah, like this one is going to cause huge issues. This one gets a little bit aggressive, like right in here, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. Anywhere else? Mm-hmm.
The eyes.
Yeah, pretty much same deal as the mouth. Anywhere else? All right. You guys are either quiet or really aggressive with your lack of supports. So actually when I printed this, I literally only did supports on some of the mouth holes and some of the eye holes. The noses pretty much print supportless. It's a really aggressive supportless, but it's supportless. And then this little, even like these overhangs under the chin also does a pretty good job printing supportless. If you use a 0.1 millimeter layer height. 0.3 would destroy this. But like I don't want to print this entire thing at 0.1 millimeters. I would triple the printing time and make it like a 5-day print. So again, there's a way in Simplify where you can slice your model and say, hey, most of this can print at 0.3, but a few areas do at 0.1. So I want to show you guys again, in case this helps speed up stuff for your prop or for your supportless model. Like if you want it to print faster, but you have like a really aggressive overhang somewhere, you can use this to sort of help combat that. So if you go into Tools and Variable Settings Wizard, it's going to dump this plane in your model, and you can use this little like scroll bar to decide where you want to put this. But basically I'm going to sort of divide this up into areas where I'm going to change the settings. So in this case, I'm just going to say, all right, what I did for this is I did most of it at like 0.3 millimeter layer height because there's like no detail in this. I just want quick, easy printing. So I'm going to do, what am I saying? I'm going to position this plane right under the eyes, which is where I start wanting a little bit more resolution with those overhangs, and do add location. And then I'll just sort of keep moving the slider up. Say once I'm done the eyes, I'm going to add another location because that can go back to fast and dirty printing. And then the other place on this, which strictly speaking, my print failed and I had to re-slice the bottom half of it, but this should print supportless on the nostrils. But like this is like a super aggressive overhang, so I'm going to right below that do another location, and right in here just going to print at like a 0.1 millimeter layer height because I just like don't want that to fail, but I also don't want to use supports because they take forever. And then I'll just cut that back off again, and pretty much I'm just going to say the mouths are going to be 0.3 for the sake of fastness. It's not a word. And then again, so I said right under here is going to be also like a point where like 0.3 millimeter layer height is going to have issues handling that in terms of overhangs and probably some like little blobby bits in it. So I'm just going to add another location, and the rest of that is going to print at 0.1. Once I've done that, I have all these different sort of lists of locations or heights in the model. I'm just going to do split processes. Don't know how you say that. And you'll notice that down here in my processes tab, it's I said that 4 different ways in 10 seconds. How do you pronounce that? Does anybody actually know? It bothers me every time I say it.
Processes.
Okay.
I'm sure like English people process too.
Yeah. Either way, it's made a list of different processes. So you can go in and edit the settings for these. So by default, it's going to be whatever you had the settings set up to earlier. So if I look at the first one, it's going to be like 0.3 layer height, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm going to do is just go down and I can click on the second one and do layer, and I'll say that was around the eyes. I'm going to set this to 0.2 and hit OK. And just kind of keep going like that. So it's pretty much I did every other one. So this, I think, should be the one around the nose. You can label these if you want to be more clear. I kind of wish it would do that automatically, honestly, because it's a little bit confusing. But so I'm going to go ahead and just set that to like 0.1 millimeter layer height. And then again, the top at this like very, very like top of the chins. Also, I'm going to set to be 0.1 millimeter layer height. So once that's done, you don't really see any changes until you go and click Prepare to Print, at which point just do Select All. And for this type of model, continuous printing layer by layer. They're just going to like stack them on top of each other and not try to like, you can set it up if you have like 10 little objects on your build plate to like print one object at a time. But in this case, that's not what we want. So again, select all for all of your processes, continuous printing, and just hit OK. And it'll usually take a hot minute to process. It's actually not that bad. Cura I find is still worse with supports for like auto generation. But it's going to go through and it's going to slice that. And it's going to take longer to print, but nowhere near as long as trying to print the whole thing at like 0.1 or 0.2 millimeter layer heights. So not only is this good for optimizing print time and kind of like looking at overhangs, if you guys are ever printing round stuff or helmets, and you had some like really icky looking layer lines on the top of that curved surface, you can do the same thing where those last few layers you print with like a 0.1 millimeter layer height, and it's going to look way, way nicer on the top. So if you can see this, you can see that the print time's gone up to like 25.5 hours. You'll also notice if you look in, it's really hard to tell because of all the crazy like strobing with the layers. But you'll notice that there's sort of very subtle differences in the print height. So you can kind of see where it like goes down from like 0.1 to 0.3 millimeters. And again, it's just going to give you a lot nicer resolution on the top. So like this will pretty much print supportless on this top area if you do it at a low enough layer height. So I just kind of wanted to show you guys that. Does anyone have any questions about that? All right. But yeah, so I just, again, wanted to bring that up in case it helps you for either your supportless, your prop, or probably will be immensely helpful if once you guys start doing masks. If not for like optimization of supports, then again, for like smoothing out that surface on the top of the head, because it's always usually kind of like a rough patch of stuff. And then if you guys ever need to like delete your processes, just again, go through and just select it and delete it. Out of sheer curiosity, I'm going to let this slice at 0.1 millimeter layer height just to see what happens. See how horrifyingly long it's going to take. But yeah. Okay, well apparently that one, okay. And if you guys are ever like trying to get rid of your processes and you're like looking at stuff and you're like, why is this only slicing this one area of the model? That's kind of what I was playing with. So if I go to Edit Process Settings and Advanced, this is that start printing at layer height and stop printing at layer height. So this is just left over from when we set it up with the multiple processes, and when you get rid of them, it doesn't change this information automatically. So I'm just going to uncheck both of them and do Prepare to Print again. You can also actually use that if you want. Like, so my print failed, and I just chose to rip it off the build plate and like reprint a new one, or like reprint a new piece of the head. But if I knew pretty close to the exact layer height where it failed, I could theoretically go through, set the start printing height, and just have it print a new model on top of the existing one and like splice it together. Theoretically. I've never tried it. It just seems dangerous to me, but you can do it. So that's basically all the slicer stuff. Does anybody have any questions about any of that stuff before I talk a little bit about like painting and like sanding and all of that good stuff? Cool.